How's it going? This is James from James Films, and today we've got a long step-by-step tutorial making this beautiful fall scene in Blender. This one's designed for beginners, and I'll walk you through working from the default cube to designing some fun shapes for our scene, scattering particles like leaves across our environment, and adding in some final detailing like different kinds of shrubs and lighting details. But let's start this project by gathering some references. This is always a good starting point for any project, so you know what you're actually trying to create. For this one, I'm actually using Pure Ref to kind of assemble a lot of my reference elements here in a mood board of sorts. I know I want these kind of arch-like shapes, so I did some research on Unsplash, found some great images of archways, and then also tapped into some photos that I took on a lot of my photo walks over the past couple years. These are a lot of photos from my campus at Princeton University, and had a lot of fun kind of putting this together to get an overall idea for the look of my architecture, as well as the actual color palette that I was going for, this kind of orangish fall tone. So for part 2a, we're going to set up the layout of our Blender viewport here. And you can keep an eye on the left here to see all the keys I'll be using for this as well. So what I always like to do is reset my camera by hitting Alt-R and Alt-G, getting that up to 0, and then scaling for Instagram resolution, which is usually 1200 by 1500 pixels. It works best for me. I then like to split my viewport up into the left being my working space, this bottom window here being my shader editor window, and then this top one being the rendered view, so one I'm actually going to be seeing through my camera once stuff is actually rendered out. So now we can actually get into blocking out the room here. This is part 2b. We'll have a lot of fun here kind of working with this default cube and creating our scene. I'll go into edit mode and remove the top and bottom faces here, so we actually have kind of an open plan, open concept here, open to the outdoors living experience. I pull my camera up into the viewport and just kind of pull up the Passepartout just so I'm seeing a little bit closer to what the camera's going to be seeing. It kind of grays out or blacks out a little bit the surroundings of my camera. So this room is a little bit tight right now, a little bit claustrophobic. So let's kind of push the scale up a bit. I'll pull this up a little bit more by going into edit mode and just pulling that back frame out by hitting G and then pulling along that Y-axis. So now this is looking a little bit larger. We can still kind of come back and scale this up. And I'm always keeping an eye on that top right view, that camera view, just to see what we're going to be seeing in our final render. I think it's important to keep that in mind as you work and actually kind of have an idea of what the camera's going to be seeing. I used Control-R to get a loop cut of this, so I'm actually going to be making two little hallways, kind of corridors here on my scene. And what I can do is grab these faces of the hallway by just clicking on them and shift selecting, and then going to face and then extrude faces along normals. You'll see that this is kind of pulling inward when I move my mouse inward, and it pulls outward when I move my mouse outward. So I'm just going to go to the top-down view by hitting numpad 7, hitting that same extrude along normals, and just pulling our faces out so we've got somewhat of a corridor here. This just adds a little bit more intrigue to the scene, so it's not just a simple default cube. We've got a little bit more going on here. And I'll just, to match up the scene, remove the faces on the top here, so we have this kind of open ceiling as well, and then just open up those sides so that some light can splash in from those sides as well. So this works pretty well. We've got kind of an initial room design here. What I actually do is add a little bit more geometry by hitting a solidify modifier, and then I can just kind of pull up the thickness, but you'll notice that it's pushing inward when I scale upward. So what I'm actually going to do is flip my normals by going to mesh, normals, and flip. And now when I scale up that thickness, it's going to be on the outside, which is where I want it to be, and not pushing inward. So this is looking pretty good, but let's actually add in an archway. So I'm going to rename this to the room mainframe, and then add in a new cube element and pull this one back into my scene, so that it's where we want our door archway to be. This is the key architectural element of my scene, this kind of nice, beautiful archway. I'll scale it up so it kind of fits the frame of the door, and then I'm going to make it wire in the viewport display here so we can actually see a little bit more how it's going to be fitting into our scene. Kind of going into edit mode and pulling up different faces here to get it to fill the frame of the door, and then clicking on these edges and then beveling them, scrolling up on my mouse wheel to add a little bit more cut so we smooth out that archway. And just like that, we've got an arch that we can then use as a boolean to cut out a hole in our scene. So once again, I'll scale this up and pull that bottom face down so it's below our geometry so we're not clipping anything. Click on our original room mainframe after renaming this to the arch back wall cutter. Click on that room mainframe, and we'll move this to a collection. I just like to keep collections of my elements to kind of keep tabs on things. So in the modifiers, I'll add in a boolean modifier and make our object the arch back wall, and bam, just like that, we've got an archway. You'll notice it's kind of cutting that floor a bit there, and so I actually really like to add in a separate plane. So I've got a little bit more control over my subdivisions because you can kind of see it's a little bit funky geometry here. This is just my personal preference, frankly, to kind of cut these out. So I'll just delete that face and delete these edges that are kind of leftover remnants of that. So now we've got our room elements here. And what I actually want to do is add back in that plane, and that's what we're going to use to scatter our particles and stuff over on our geometry. So I'll add in this plane, scale it up so that it's filling our room. By going up onto numpad 7, you can see exactly how this is going to fit. And then you can just grab individual edges and pull them out so that they are filling up our scene. I don't like to have these going too far, so we actually are not wasting any kind of geometry in our scene. So I just fill it up just so it's filling enough of the scene that I need here. So you can see that's looking pretty good. Pull this out a little bit more, and that is our ground plane. I'm just gonna crank up the clipping on my camera to something pretty extreme just so that we're not cutting off any of that back edge. And then we can actually just kind of rotate the camera around here a bit and play around to see how it fits in our scene. I like to kind of go back and forth and revisit the camera settings quite a bit, and often turn on the composition guides like rule of thirds and the center to see exactly where different elements are in my scene, so stuff is framed up nice and properly and looks really good. Like I said, I revisit this a whole bunch, and I encourage you to do the same. Just kind of keep coming back with fresh eyes to look at how your scene is filling out. So with our plane selected, I'm going to add some subdivisions to this just so we have some geometry to work with when we're going to be sculpting out our mesh a little bit. So I kind of jumped ahead here a bit, but I'm going to be going into the sculpt mode and pulling up on the faces here. I really like to kind of just pull around and have this look like almost like soil or dirt is collecting around the edges of this room over years, centuries, who knows how long this room has been here. So this is a really simple process of just kind of going around and based on your own personal taste, just kind of pulling up the corners of the room here so we've got a little bit of interest to our geometry. You can smooth things out by hitting shift and then left clicking. So as you're kind of creating these bumps, you can smooth them over a little bit by just kind of pushing around like that. This is a really fun process. It's one I like to spend a bit of time with as well here, kind of creating a little bit of imperfection to our room. Because if you look at nature, there really are no perfectly flat, smooth surfaces in nature. And the issue with 3D software is when you create something, it always has perfectly smooth, straight edges. So you kind of have to make this a little bit imperfect. So you see I've shaded smooth here. Now we've got a little bit more interest to our scene. We've got some kind of dirt and dust collecting in our corners. And what I'm going to do is add in some crown molding. There are a bunch of tutorials on YouTube that go in a bit more detail with this in particular. So I'm just going to go a little bit surface level with this on how I'm doing this. So what I like to do is select these faces and then hit I and inset them inward in my scene like that. So we've got these kind of little fancy crown molding things. And then we can do the same thing as we did before, extrude faces along normal and pull them out just a little bit. And then you can kind of, bevel them a little bit. So just like that, we've got some nice little kind of crown molding details. And I did this throughout the room just to kind of add in some detailing. And so just based on your room elements, have some fun with this and kind of play around. You can kind of play around with your edges and smooth them out and make them look a little bit interesting. Add some cool details to the scene. There's also this add-on that I'll show briefly here, which has a whole bunch of really awesome bevel profiles. So when you select on edges like this, you can go over to crown molding tools, convert it to crown molding, and then you can actually select the specific profile of these different bevel profiles to add a little bit of extra crown molding details. The add-on page has a really nice tutorial that goes into greater detail than I can cover in this video on how to actually play around with this really simply, but it comes with some great tools that allow you to scale things up and just change out your profile with just a couple clicks. You can do this without the add-on. It just takes a little bit more time to kind of make these different profiles and setting them up. So I use that to fill out my scene. So we've got a couple different crown molding elements there. And now what I'm going to do is actually make that kind of cool curved element by adding in a NURBS curve. If you remember from that intro, we kind of had that interesting little glass corridor, if you will, at the end of our scene. And what I did is went over to the details of this curve and made the endpoints snap to those points by clicking on this endpoint. And I kind of struggled initially to find where this was. It's a little bit confusing at times, but I wanted to go to the active spline tab and then endpoint and select that endpoint. So now you see the points are at the endpoints of our curve. This just makes it a little bit easier when you're sculpting this out so that you know exactly where the curve is going to be ending. So I rotate this around, and to add new points, you just click on one of them, and then you can just hit E to extrude out that point and create a new point as well. So once you're happy with this, you can just kind of move it around, and you can grab individual edges and just kind of pull them around like that. And I like to use the grid lines here as kind of guides for me for where this is going to be linking up. So I kind of have some symmetry to it. I want a little bit of randomness as well to this curve, but it's fun kind of just playing around with this and pulling our scene around. So I just added a little bit of snake-like details to this by just extruding it a couple times. And after just a couple clicks, you've got some interesting geometry starting to brew here with our NURBS curve. So now it's important to note that this is a curve element, so you want to actually convert this to a mesh to play around with. But before I do that, I often like to save out these NURBS curves just before I actually start to play around with them too much. So I'm actually going to duplicate this, hide that from my viewport, and then we're just going to add this to a new collection after converting one of them to a mesh. So I'll bring this one back in and just select it and then make a new collection, and we'll just call this backup. So just in case you make any mistakes when you're starting to add in geometry, you have that backup of your curve as well. So now I can actually go in and bring this into our edit mode and scale up by hitting G and Z and just pulling this up so we're extruding out. Now we've got some geometry to work with here. This is now a 3D little glass window, so it's looking pretty cool. So I can match this up a bit better in my scene by kind of pulling it back and keeping an eye on that viewport to see in the top right how it's framing up with our camera view. And it's looking pretty cool so far. So we've got this interesting scene. It's maybe a little bit too tall, so we can select that top edge, pull it down by hitting G and then pulling it down a bit. So now we've got our first glass window. So we can shade that smooth, and if it's looking a little bit blocky still, you can just hit on auto smooth for the normals, and it smooths out those details just like that. So this is looking really nice. Let's actually just duplicate this one here, and what I'm going to do is just flip it around on the XY plane, pulling it over to the other side. It's so thin that you actually can't even see it from the top point here, and we'll actually change that out in just a second here, add a bit more 3D geometry to it. It's just a perfectly flat plane, so now you can only see it from this one side here. But now we've got two of them kind of in this interesting glass pattern here that we're going to start to fill out a bit more. So we've got our two edges here, so let's add in a solidify modifier here to add in just a little bit of geometry to them, just ever so slightly to make them big enough so that when we add in our texture, it's going to look cool with our glass mirror. So I'm just going to flip the normals for this one again, just so that it is flipping the right way when I'm scaling this out with the solidify modifier. And we're just gonna have this be 0.2 meter thickness. It doesn't need to be too thick. We'll do the same thing for this other one here. Add a solidify modifier and make it 0.2 meters. Play around with the thickness, have fun with it, and always rename your layers so that you know what they are. So it's not just NURBS curve 2, NURBS curve 3. Name these to the glass curves that you're gonna be making. So glass curve right and glass curves left. So we've got our two glass curves created. They're looking pretty cool. And so we can always play around with these a bit, kind of move them around in our scenes so that they're filling out properly. But I'm pretty happy with how that's looking so far, frankly. I think that's looking quite nice. Yeah, the scene is starting to come together, huh? So we're having some good time with this. And again, always revisit and kind of take your own approach to this. If you want to fill out your scene differently, I just duplicated this plane here and pulled it back, so we've got a little bit more geometry back there as well in our scene. And you can actually play around with this too by, moving it around, going into edit mode and kind of scaling things out differently. So we just have these two ground planes to work with here. And this is where we're going to be scattering a lot of our leaves and stuff on. So I'm just going to kind of add in some more details, maybe some bigger hills on this one since they're kind of in the background. I don't want that perfectly flat horizon. I'm going to kind of scale it up so that we've got some bigger hills back there in our geometry to work with. So this is a lot of fun. Again, just really take your time with this process and add in these cool imperfections. It really does go a long way in adding realism to your scene. By having these kind of hills and different kind of divots and things in your scene to work with. And once you're happy with that, you can start to play around a bit more. And we can start to move on to one of my favorite steps in any process, which is starting to kind of get a basic idea for the lighting. So I'm setting up my render to be in cycles using the GPU, and we'll go to our initial lighting design here. And so for this one, I actually decided to use a really fun add-on called Physical Starlight and Atmosphere, which I've already installed here. You can just use an HDRI or whatever you want for the scene, but this one gives me so much flexibility over the procedural lighting design for my scenes. There's so much to do with it, and it's really fun to just kind of take a ton of time to tweak every single individual parameter. And it's really all physically based, so you're getting some really beautiful atmospheric fall off in the distance too, and it just looks phenomenal. And just with a couple clicks, you can get some really awesome results. So I always have a lot of fun working with this, and just to kind of, for clarity, make things a bit easier, I'm renaming all my layers and moving them into some collections here before starting off. So I have that room elements collection, and then make a new collection for my camera and lighting, so it's easy to find those as well too. So we've got those. You can even change the color of these collections too. It's just easy to kind of keep an eye on your different elements so that you're not kind of hunting through thousands of layers. You'll thank me later for this. This is really a good practice to do, to really just kind of keep an idea of what different layers you're working with, so you don't have like 1,000 different things you're parsing through. And then you can start playing with the lighting. So now in my Physical Starlight and Atmosphere add-on, I can kind of maneuver this lighting around here. And this is looking really awesome already. We've got some really nice results coming through here with this light going into our scene. And so you'll see here, there are just a ton of different parameters you can change, anything from the temperature of the atmosphere here. So I kind of made this a little bit warmer to kind of go along with kind of our warm fall vibes, because right now there's a lot of blue peeking through here. So I kind of wanted this to be a bit warmer. I pulled up the sun a bit more so it's at a higher angle, kind of bathing our scene in wonderful light here through this archway. And this is looking really nice. You can change the diameter of the sun itself to add in a little bit more light as well. You can also change the density of the atmosphere as well to make it a little bit hazier. So you see when I crank up the density, we've got a lot more orangish yellow colors. You can add in procedural stars and just change some of the atmospheric scattering properties, even change the color and absorption of the atmosphere too. So this is always a lot of fun to just play around with this. And again, if you have this add-on, I just encourage you to take a lot of time and just play around with all the controls. There's literally like millions of different possibilities with this as you work through and change. And it's just so much fun to play around with the details and just see in real time how it updates your scene, how it changes, just a little bit of adjusting changes so much of your scene. So I'm really starting to like how this is looking. We've got this wonderful kind of orange hue bathing our scene here. Very fall-like, and especially once we start adding in some plants and stuff to the scene, it's gonna look really wonderful. We're gonna have this beautiful fall design. And what I like to often do is add in a second sun lamp just to have a little bit more directionality with the sun, because I find that with physical starlight and atmosphere, we don't always get the best shadows with it. So it's nice to enhance just a little bit more of those shadows with the sun in the same exact angle direction as our starlight sun as well here. So I add in a sun and just kind of flip to different sides to make sure that it's angled properly. And we'll add in a slight orange hue to this and just up the strength so it's a little bit brighter in our scene. It doesn't need to be too intense. I kind of put it up a little bit too high initially, but 20 seems to be giving us some good results. So that's looking pretty nice so far. I've added that to my camera and lighting collection as well, so we know where to find it if we're trying to come back and revisit that sun, which we definitely will at times to change things in. But let's add in a tree just to see how this is looking, see how that's catching the light. And if you ever look at trees in nature, they're kind of somewhat translucent, the leaves, so when sunlight is passing through, you kind of get this really beautiful back glow to them. And I really wanted this to shine, so I used the Polygoniq add-on, which I've linked in the description if you want to purchase this. It comes chock full of a whole bunch of different trees. They've actually released a free version of this with a couple free assets. I've linked that as well. This is a really fun add-on. I always have a lot of fun playing around with adding these trees and plants into my scene. And then they also have really wonderful materials that you can go through and edit and make your own if you want. I often will adjust the colors of these trees. Like you'll see for this one, I wasn't really too pleased with how this color was looking initially. So I kind of changed the color of it a bit and scale this up so that it was kind of filling out as if there's some trees growing in those little corridors that we made earlier on. You can see it's starting to catch the light a little bit too, and this is something I really wanted to draw your eye into the frame. So you see that part of the left of the tree is really starting to catch that light well, but by changing the color of the leaves to something a bit more orange, we're kind of matching the lighting from the back as well, and we're getting some really nice glow through it. So we can actually start to create some more materials to see how that lighting is going to impact our scene. And to start off, I'm going to actually start to texture those glass windows by building off a material from the Blender Kit add-on. And you can just search for glass and materials, and there's a whole bunch of really different cool ones to choose from that give you a nice starting point. You can build these materials from scratch, but I really feel like it's easy to kind of start with something and then build off of it to make it your own. There's also a whole bunch of categories, so you can search that way. And so I looked for a glass that I really liked and kind of wanted to build off of that by adding in some interesting color. So there's this architectural glass that I find myself using a lot. I really like the node setup that they have for it. It just kind of gives me a better profile for the glass than the default glass material from Blender that you can use to add into your Principle of the SDF. This one's just a better starting point. But you can see it's not really doing too much for our scene right now. It's just kind of this perfectly clear looking glass. And so what I wanted to actually do is change this out a bit more. So I've kind of changed out the thickness of this as well by applying in the solidify modifier and then maybe kind of scaling it up a little bit. I did like a UV projection on here just to make sure that there weren't any issues, because you can see there's some kind of weird shadows being cast. And this could be because of the incidence of refraction, or the index of refraction rather, or some other kind of properties. So what I like to do is play around with these and kind of scale them around in my scene. And then you can kind of go and have some fun with the different materials as well. So you can see I just play around here quite a bit, and I was just trying to figure out what that issue was. I think it was just a camera angle issue. So when I was looking at it, there's from different angles you can see it's kind of like overlapping with itself a little bit there. So just playing around with this index of refraction, I kind of got rid of that a bit more by kind of changing out the properties. This is looking acceptable, still like a little bit of overlap here, but kind of changing the index of refraction to something that makes a little bit more physical sense. For the glass, it kind of worked a bit better and gave me something nice to work with as well in my scene. So that's looking pretty awesome. Just kind of playing around with this a bit, we've got something that looks really interesting. It almost kind of looks like a hologram projection in the back there, which is kind of what I was going for. And by changing actually the colors of these as well, like the glossy color, you can get a really interesting orange hue to it. So that's looking pretty cool. I really like how this is kind of starting to come together. We've got some really interesting results starting to fill out our scene. And again, I just take a lot of time with this. I encourage you to pause the video and just have a lot of fun experimenting with this on your own, adjusting the colors to see how it affects your scene. And so when I really cranked up the transparency, I got some really interesting shadows. So as the light's passing through, you've got these almost like orange glow bars kind of coming through the scene, which I really liked a lot. And the way that interacts with the tree is really beautiful as well. And so just with a couple clicks and adjustments to that glass material, you can kind of keep it subtle. You get some really nice results. And this is matching kind of the look I was going for initially with my mood board too, with the really beautiful orange profile kind of coming through here. So this is really, really doing our scene justice. I really like how this is looking, and it was super simple to do that. So I can just kind of adjust the trees a bit more here, just kind of play around with things. And let's add in another tree as well from Polygoniq and see how this affects our scene too. I make it editable as well so that I can change out the materials to match that same color from before. And I can just copy that over onto the leaves from our original scene as well. I'll just kind of rename this as well just to make it easier for me to reference it. The leaf orange color here. And so I just add that in as the material for the leaves as well so that we're having the same color. And I'll add this one into our left side of the corridor. So we're framing out our scene really well with just two simple little trees. There's a little bit of clipping going on, but you're not really seeing that side of the tree anyway from our perspective. So it looks just fine for our purposes here. This is looking quite nice. We can change the sun angle a little bit more so that it's kind of, washing our scene a little bit more. It was a little bit too bright white light almost there. You can see if I really crank that up the strength, it's kind of washing out our scene a little bit too much. So by changing that angle a little bit more, it kind of, calms our light down a bit, so it's not as intense. But let's add in some more elements to the scene as well here. It's looking a little bit dull so far. So we can add in a lot more leaves to our scene by using the Graswald Add-on, which I've also linked below. You can create a new profile with new settings, and it initially scatters these kind of proxy particles on your scene. Then you can look for specific species, and they've got a whole bunch of different leaves presets here. So I can scatter these clumps of leaves across my scene, and I can change their scale so that they're a little bit smaller, making more physical sense in our scene. And you can also up the density so you're scattering a whole lot more. And that's already looking really interesting and fall-like. There's a couple different varieties of these leaves as well, so you can kind of experiment with how those look in our scene. And so that's looking really cool. There's a lot of different parameters you can change out. Like I said, the size, you can also change the scale randomness, the density, the source emitter of them, a lot of randomization, and it's a lot of really fun work with just a couple clicks here to get some interesting looking leaves scattering in our scene. So I wanted to, you can also hit auto name all systems, so it actually names the grass or the leaves accordingly, so that if you're adding a whole bunch of different particle systems, which one corresponds to which one, which is always helpful to know. Just the same thing with labeling our collections. It's important to label these collections as well, so that you know how to find them again in the future when you're revisiting these things. So I just added in another species of grass or of leaves as well here, just so we have a little bit of variety to our scene, and just kind of played around with this a bit. And had some fun just kind of changing the scattering of these leaves in our scene. You can auto name all systems here, and yeah, it's a lot of fun to just play around with these different things in our scene. So I actually accidentally duplicated the same one here, so I went through and added in a all new collection with different leaves to scatter in our scene. So I created new settings for this second set of leaves here, just for some variety. Added in some various leaves, oak leaves, maple leaves, you got a lot to choose from here. So I just added in a different variety of leaves here and, changed them out a bit more, scaled them up, added in a little bit more to the scene here. So we've got some variety, different patches of clumps. And we've got what looks to be a pretty cool fall scene, very crunchy leaves, really beautiful. Really fun, really easy to do that. And you can just see we've got all of our leaves scattered in our scene, just like that. I can also change out the color of these leaves too, and so it matches the color of the leaves from our leaves of the trees too if I wanted to do that. So that's fun as well. Really a lot of customizability, which is great with all these add-ons. And, I always say that Blender is free, but, there are these add-ons that really make your job a lot easier. So you don't have to do so much of the heavy lifting yourselves with designing leaves and trees and things like that. You can tap into the amazing resources that the community has been developing over the past couple of years. Just so much great resources out there. And I try to make it my mission here with some of these tutorials to pay homage to some of these resources, direct you over to them, and help support these creators as they make some really awesome stuff for Blender and really make it industry standard. These in the grand scheme of things really are not that expensive compared to, paying for, some software like Maya or stuff like that. That's a lot more expensive. So, just sending a couple of bucks these creators' way is, I think, always really helpful to do to support the community and support the continued development of Blender. So that's a lot of fun. So you can see I'm just kind of playing around with a lot of these different add-ons, assets, just making it look really nice. And it's just fun to kind of go through and customize these as well. So definitely take your time with this and, just make your scene what it is. What's also really cool with this add-on is you can actually use different masks. So what I did is weight painted where I specifically wanted these leaves to show so that we weren't wasting any of the particles in places that they wouldn't really even be visible, like behind the walls, for example. And you can just recalculate the density so that these things are only showing up where you want them to. And you can do this for both layers. So you kind of create in exactly where you want these to be. And this is really fun, really easy to do. And so now you see that we don't have any of the leaves showing up outside of our kind of glass faces here. They're just inside of where we want them to be. You can do the same thing with the front layer as well too. And it's just really quick and simple to do that with just a couple different density masks with these weight painting layers. Really fun, really simple to do. And like I said, I'm always revisiting these things, adding new trees in and kind of seeing how they fill out my scene, how stuff works. It's just a lot of fun to kind of go through and just revisit things, see how stuff changes. And you're just seeing the whole process. And, for some of my tutorials, I just kind of cut things down and show you, end to end what simply is going on. But, it's a lot of trial and error. And I think it's important to be aware of that. There's a lot of stuff that will be on the cutting room floor. So sometimes you'll add in a tree. And I think I might end up removing this tree actually because I didn't like how it was framing out my scene. But that's all part of the game. Just go through, take the time it takes to just play around and see what works and what doesn't work for your scene. And sometimes it won't end up working and you just might need to take it out of the scene, swap it out with something else and just have a lot of fun playing around with things and making it your own, making it something new. That's all part of the process, and I think that's what makes 3D so fun, is there are infinite possibilities with what you can do with each scene, and just kind of discovering those as you work is always a lot of fun. It's like the Bob Ross things, happy accidents. Sometimes you drop something into your scene, and it's like, hey, this actually works really well. This is really cool, and I didn't expect this to look the way it does in the scene. And you can kind of work off of that and build out your scene accordingly, have a lot of fun revisiting things, and sometimes if I just feel really stuck with a scene, I'll just literally put it aside and maybe revisit it the next day or maybe a week or two afterwards with a fresh set of eyes, a new perspective on the scene, and just have a lot of fun building it out anew. It's kind of like rediscovering it, if you will. And you'll see things that you maybe missed before, like, oh, hey, this tree placing it kind of closer to the camera here really catches the light in an interesting way and kind of adds this natural, beautiful framing to my scene. So kind of the way I'm setting these trees up here where they're really close to the camera, you can see the leaves are really catching that orange glow just in such a beautiful way. And this was actually kind of a happy accident. I didn't realize that putting them in that specific position would work so well, but I just love how it really kind of splashes that orange color throughout the whole scene. It's just really stunning and really came together really well and kind of tied the scene together in a way that I didn't really expect it would. So it was really beautiful. And so I always have on denoising here as well, my viewport, just so that I'm not looking through a ton of noise when I'm working. Just for some system specs here as well, I've got an NVIDIA Quadro RTX 5000 GPU, so I can actually use that when I'm both denoising in the viewport and then also rendering this out as well. I think it works really well that way. It's really fun and super quick. Very nice. It was really game-changing to update my rig about a year ago to a PC that I built myself. I had been working with a laptop before that was, it was nice. It did its work for a while, but it was time for an upgrade. So I upgraded to the PC that I'm currently using right now, which just works so much better when I'm starting to scatter just a ton of particles or adding in a lot of different geometry like these trees and leaves and stuff to my scene. Just my viewport is so much more responsive now, which is delightful. It's really nice to not be fighting through so much noise. But be mindful. So if you are working with an older computer, maybe try to scale back your particles, or maybe not keep them visible all the time in the viewport and just have them display in the rendered mode when you're actually rendering out the scene, so that you're not bogging down your viewport and fighting through just a ton of noise as you're working as well. So that's just a little quick tip as well for kind of speeding up your renders, and also speeding up your viewport, making it a bit more responsive as well. So I added in a point light because I was noticing that these hallways were like a little bit dark as well. So I just kind of pulled this over to the side of the corridor just so we can kind of backlight these trees a little bit so that it's not looking so dark in that corridor. So it kind of almost looks like there's like a room or something maybe off to the side. It's a little bit of mystery. Who knows what's behind there? It could be like a cool, different chamber with a lot more cool trees and foliage and stuff over there. So I add that to both sides of my scene as well, and just kind of crank up the power quite a bit with an orange hue to it. And it's looking quite nice. You can just duplicate this as well, drag it right over. By hitting Alt-D, you actually make it a linked duplicate. So any changes you make to either light, it will just make it a global change between them. And so that's looking really nice. We've got some kind of interesting kind of colors splashing through the corridor as well. So this is looking really pretty. And you'll see I'm revisiting the lighting once again here. This is something I preach all the time. Always be revisiting these things. Always be kind of looking for new ways to make changes and adjust things. Just always coming back and fixing things and tweaking things to get them to a place where you're really happy with it. This is a fun process. I've used the word fun a lot here, but I really do enjoy this, and I don't know really how else to express that to you. It's just a really fun process working through 3D renders. I just think it's just so cool what you can do with just a few simple clicks with things, and how drastically different each scene can look by just clicking on just a couple parameters. Like literally just adjusting the light by just a couple watts makes so much difference to our scene. And so now actually adding in some final shapes and final tweaks to our scene, this is where the magic really comes together and just puts a little bow on our scene here as well. So I just kind of adjusted the glass a little bit as well. Again, just kind of adjusting the hue of it a bit more, made it a little bit more orange to kind of match a bit more with the color of our scene. You kind of got this really rich, almost reddish orange here, which I thought looked interesting too. And just had a lot of fun kind of playing around with this. And what I actually wanted to do is kind of make it a little bit more immersive, as if these things are kind of coming towards you like they were glass ribbons. So I scaled these things down a bit more, duplicated them, and just kind of pulled them forward in my scene. Sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't work. I ended up keeping a couple of these things, deleted some of the other ones. But I just thought this added some interesting depth and kind of leading lines into my scene as well too. So it just kind of fills out the top of that frame really, really well. And just looks really pretty, just kind of draws your eye naturally into the frame of the scene. I kind of went over into just like the shader view, the solid view rather, just to see how this was looking in my scene as well. And if I was clipping anything, because I wasn't sure if I was kind of intersecting with the leaves of this tree at all. So just took some time with that just to make sure that it worked well. It wasn't doing any weirdness with the leaves as well. It's a little bit tricky since these things are like somewhat translucent. It's a little bit tough to kind of see where they're overlapping with things and kind of where they wouldn't overlap. And since they're curved, I tried to follow the natural curve of the trees as well too, so that they kind of wrapped around them almost like they were kind of ribbons wrapping around the trees, kind of changing their angle a little bit so that they made physical sense, as if they're maybe intersecting with the glass ones from behind. This was a kind of a fun process, and it got a little bit cluttered at times too, so I kind of had to be careful with how this was filling out the scene. And again, always keep an eye on that render view. And if you don't have this already turned on, like I turned on earlier, having the guides, the viewport guides, is always really helpful as well too, just to kind of see where things are filling out your scene. Like I said, the rule of thirds one I think is the most helpful one for me, just to kind of see where these different elements would fall in the different kind of perspective of our camera. Kind of filling out that top third. You've got these ribbons here, and maybe just bleeding ever so slightly into the middle third of the composition. But this was a lot of fun to do as well, just to kind of tweak this and get it to something that looked interesting, made sense physically, wasn't too cluttered, wasn't too junky, and just kind of changing my camera perspective a lot to see how this fills out my scene. It was a process, and it was interesting one. So this is starting to look kind of cool, a little bit more intrigue, almost like these, like I said, ribbons in our scene as well, intersecting in kind of unique ways. You don't have to do this. This is just kind of like an optional step. I just played around with this and it was, kind of worked in some ways, kind of didn't work in other ways. But happy accidents. It might work, it might just all of a sudden be the thing that kind of ties your scene together and makes it beautiful and takes it that extra step to make it a really cool 3D scene. So you see I deleted a couple of these. I wasn't too happy with how it looked. We took those off as well and just kind of revisited those glass curves again, duplicating them again, starting again. This is again what I keep saying here, the 3D process is very iterative. We're always going through, adding in different things, changing things out, deleting things, moving things around. And you're seeing very much the unedited version here. So, no judgment, just like, for your process here, you're never going to get it in like the first shot. If you do, maybe that might happen, but it's a lot of trial and error, seeing what works and what doesn't. And I really can't stress that enough. It is very important to kind of keep revisiting things, maybe even showing a family friend or a friend of yours just what your scene is starting to look like to get a second opinion on things. And don't be afraid to share your work as well too. I'll make this comment here as well, especially for beginners. It's very daunting when you look on, ArtStation or Instagram or Pinterest or wherever you find your artwork, and you see very beautiful, polished, finished renders. People are really only putting out their best work, and you're not seeing a lot of the trial and error that went into creating those renders oftentimes when stuff is posted on social media. Sometimes you'll see maybe clay renders or kind of works in progress, but you're not seeing a lot of what I'm showing you right here, right now, which is the trial and error of me literally deleting objects from my scene, adding things in, changing things out. It's very much a process, and there's a lot of stuff that will never see the light of day, and that's totally fine. That's all part of the 3D process. You can't be afraid to make mistakes. You can't be afraid to share something out and get feedback on things. Hope for constructive feedback, and especially when you're critiquing other people's work. Always be constructive, always help people, point them in the right direction. And that's what I found is so wonderful about the 3D community in particular, is how supportive everyone is in this. How willing people are to provide wonderful knowledge that they've gained over years of working with the software. And with these tutorials, a lot of times it's kind of me paying it forward to the community as well. I think there's so many people who've helped me get to where I am with this position and being able to do a lot of this work and just, experience the wonders of the 3D world. And I want to make sure that I can bring new people into the fold as well, especially in a time when, everything is happening very much online. People are very much, spread out. This is one way to kind of bring the world together, is learning a new skill like 3D software, which is perfectly designed for the current environment that we're in. All you need is a computer. You can work from wherever in the world and make some really beautiful scenes. And with Blender being a free software, there's no barrier to entry in terms of cost of getting into this and starting to play around and have some fun with the software. So that was just a brief aside. You can see I'm still kind of workshopping the scene in the background here. But it's just a really great community. And, if you are a beginner and this is one of your first tutorials you're watching, seriously, I want to welcome you to the wonderful world of 3D software. The Blender community in particular is really phenomenal. There are so many new developments being made with the software itself. So it's really cool to just kind of keep an eye on the developments of that software and just really get involved with the community. Don't be afraid to ask questions, reach out to creators who inspire you. And just kind of, see where it takes you. There's just so much new stuff to learn. I'm still learning things on a daily basis with the software, and I've been doing this for, 2-3 years now. It's really fun. There's so much to learn. And I think it's very important to always be humble as well with it too, and never feel like you know everything. There's always new stuff to be learned, always new software packages and things to discover. And I think that's important to keep in mind as you work through, as you kind of continue to grow as a 3D artist. Always be learning, always be seeking out knowledge, always be trying to practice and grow your skill set, adding new things to your toolbox in Blender and 3D, and you're training your artistic eye as well too. I think it's helpful to kind of look at other people's works, see what works for theirs and what doesn't work, and kind of build off that as well too. So you can see I'm just kind of adjusting the lighting here as well. I'm kind of placing these point lights just to see how it affects our glass, because I was noticing it was kind of getting a little bit compressed. We weren't really seeing the beautiful curved layers as much of this. So I kind of wanted to add in a little bit of depth to that. So I experimented a bit with adding these point lights to kind of catch the light a little bit in those corridors where it kind of curves around inward on itself a little bit. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work, because I kind of took a couple of them out. But again, all part of the experimentation process. You're seeing the behind the scenes here. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, once again, experimenting with these glass curves. I rename them as well so that I keep an eye on them. So now it's just a whole bunch of glass curves duplicate, but I know that they're the glass ribbon on the left, glass ribbon on the right. And we're starting to get somewhere pretty cool. So this is looking, pretty close to like a final scene here. I just kind of go through and tweak the lighting a little bit more to get it to a place where I was happy with it. Maybe adjusting the density a bit. I made it a little bit denser so that it's a little bit more orange. There's a little bit too much blue in kind of the upper atmosphere of our sky. I can actually go into our sunlight as well. Maybe, crank up its intensity a little bit more, see what that does. It's looking pretty decent as well too. Maybe we kind of pull it back a little bit. So yeah, that's looking a little bit better. And that is where I think I ended up calling it because it looked really nice how the leaves were. They were kind of getting washed out before with the brightness of our sun, but now you can kind of really see the individual clumps of leaves piles, which is looking really cool. We're getting some really interesting results from that as well. So that's looking really cool. Getting some really cool results with the leaves. What I didn't also talk about is I added in some textures to the walls as well. Super simple textures that you can get from Blender Kit just by searching up plaster and adding that into the wall and kind of scaling it up accordingly. That is a really simple process as well to do. I just basically kept it kind of almost like a clear, pure white as well because I didn't want it to be too busy or too dark. I wanted it to be a nice bright scene, and it was very easy to make it a little bit too dark because of how closed off some of the walls were. And so I kind of kept it open and looking nice. So yeah, this is pretty much the final scene. I do a little bit of post-processing in Photoshop with stuff oftentimes just to add in a little bit more contrast or change the lighting ever so slightly. I ended up taking that tree out here for the final render. And then I also added in some string lights too as well that I kind of modeled in a different scene. But I encourage you to kind of have some fun with this, play with it on your own, add in your own little details and things. But I hope this kind of gave you an interesting approach to how to build out architecture in simple and beautiful ways. So thank you so much for following along this long tutorial. I'd love to see your results. As always, tag me on Instagram at James_films. I'd love to see what you put together. And I want to thank my Patreon supporters as well for making this video possible. You are all wonderful. Thank you for your support, and I'll see you on the next one as well. Have a great day.